Hello, my name is Steve Langford, and I'm the author of this book, Life in the Spirit. Thank you for taking just a few minutes to let me tell you about the book. The thrust of the book is captured in the subtitle, Life in the Spirit, Reflecting on the Work of the Holy Spirit in Our Lives. In my experience as a pastor, I've come to the conclusion that most people in the pew know very little about the Holy Spirit. There is very little understanding about the Spirit's work in our lives or the Spirit's role in what we call salvation. And so this book was written to address that lack of understanding and that lack of knowledge. In the New Testament, there are three major passages that talk about the work and the role of the Holy Spirit. The first is found in John 14, where Jesus speaks of the Spirit as the Comforter, the Advocate, the Helper. Those are three different translations for the same word. Jesus speaks of the Spirit as the Spirit of truth, and it is in the Spirit and through the Spirit that both the Father and Jesus take up dwelling in us. The second major text is found in Paul's letter to the Romans, in Romans chapter 8, where Paul talks about the difference between life in the Spirit and life according to the law of sin and death. It is through the Spirit that we move beyond the law of sin and death. It is by the Spirit that we put to death the deeds of the flesh, that is our basic human nature. It is as we are led by the Spirit that we are the children of God, and the Spirit nurtures within us an intimacy with God by which we dare to cry out, Abba, Father. The third of those great texts is found in the book of Galatians, where Paul talks about life in the Spirit as opposed to life in the flesh and living by the law. As we live by the Spirit, as we are led by the Spirit, as we keep in step with the Spirit, the Spirit moves us beyond the natural inclinations of our basic human. That's what Paul calls the flesh. And the Spirit begins to work within us, producing within us the fruit of the Spirit, the ability to love as Jesus loved, to live out of joy and peace, the ability to exercise self-control so that we are patient and kind, faithful and generous and gentle in the way we treat other people. In addition to these three great texts, there are numerous individual verses and isolated references to the Spirit. And what I do in the book is I explore these three great texts along with the majority of those individual references in an attempt to get an overview, a broad understanding of the work of the Holy Spirit in our lives and the role of the Holy Spirit in that which we call salvation. If we don't know the Spirit, how can we recognize when the Spirit is at work within us? And if we don't understand the work of the Spirit, how can we cooperate with the Spirit when the Spirit is at work in us and through us? Hopefully this book will answer some of those questions that we have about the Spirit. Jesus teaches us that the Spirit is the very indwelling presence of God in which both the Father and Jesus, the risen Christ, live in us. It is through the Spirit that Christ lives in us and Christ lives through us. The Spirit lives in us as individuals, and the Spirit lives within us and among us as Christian community. It is the Spirit, Jesus tells us, that draws us into relationship with God. It is the Spirit that nurtures a freedom within us in relationship to God. It is the Spirit that cultivates a sense of intimacy with God to the degree that we're able to cry out, Abba, Father, as in our relationship with God. The very heart of the Spirit's work, though, is in growing us up spiritually. It is the Spirit who transforms our hearts and our minds and thereby our lives. In 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 18, Paul says we are being transformed from one degree of glory to the next. And this transformation is the work of the Holy Spirit. The Spirit is the one growing us up into the likeness of Christ. And the heart of that transforming, maturing work that the Spirit does in us is in what the Apostle Paul talked about, referred to as the renewing of our mind. In Romans chapter 12, Paul said, stop letting the world squeeze you into its mold. See, Paul understood that how we think has already been shaped by the world in which we live. And Paul is saying, stop living out of that kind of thinking. Stop letting the world squeeze you into its mold. And be transformed. And how does that transformation take place? By the renewing of your mind. And that's the work of the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit is the one who teaches us spiritual truth. In John 14, verse 27, Jesus said, now the Spirit of truth will teach you and will remind you of everything that I've said to you. And in chapter 16, Jesus said, and the Spirit of truth will guide you into all truth. In 1 Corinthians 2, Paul talked about how the Spirit knows the deep things of God and the mind of God and the character of God. And the Spirit who explores and knows the deep things of God then reveals those things to us so that we can live out of the wisdom of God with what Paul says is the mind of Christ. You see, the mind of Christ is thinking that is shaped by the character of God and the ways of God. The mind of Christ is thinking that has been taught to us by the Spirit of God. The writer of Ephesians and Colossians talks about this as putting off the old self, the self that the world told us we needed to be if we wanted to be accepted and have value. It is putting off this old self and its way of thinking and putting on the new self, and the catalyst of that putting off and that putting on is being made new in the spirit of your mind, allowing the Spirit of God to teach us the deep things of God so that our thinking begins to be shaped by the character of God and the ways of God. For you see, here's the thing. How we think determines how we live. How we think about another person determines how we treat them. And when we begin to think with the mind of Christ, when the Spirit leads us beyond the way the world trained us to think and teaches us the ways of God so that we think with the mind of Christ, then how we live begins to reflect the ways of God. The mind of Christ produces the ways of God in our lives. As our minds are renewed, our hearts are cleansed, and our lives are transformed. And this is the work of the Spirit. In the book, I attempt to describe that process and how it happens and how we resist it and sabotage it. You see, what Paul tries to tell us, both in Romans 8 and in Galatians 5, is that to live by the Spirit is a different way of living. And it's a different way of dealing with our humanness. And it's a different way of living in relationship with God. For as we learn to live by the Spirit, as we learn to be led by the Spirit, as we learn to keep in step with the Spirit transforms our hearts and our minds and our lives. The Spirit produces within us a deep sense of peace and joy out of which we live. And out of that peace and joy, then, we can choose to love as Jesus loved. The Spirit empowers us to love as Jesus loved. In other words, the Spirit empowers us to do what we cannot do in our own strength. Well, I hope you'll get a copy of the book and read it. I hope you'll use it with a study group or share it if you find it beneficial to your own spiritual life, that you'll share it with others. And I would love to have communication from you and get your feedback about the book. You can find a copy of it on my website at PastorSteveLangford.com. or you can find it on the website of the publisher, Trafford.com, Trafford, Trafford.com, or you can find it at any of the online retailers. I'd love to hear from you as you read it and study it and use it. You can communicate with me through my website. And that website again is PastorSteveLangford.com. Well, I look forward to hearing from you. Until then, may you walk in the Spirit so that you may love as Jesus loved.